His name is Little Jeff. And I remember countless things about him, but one thing in particular, I remember him having a little chirp in the hospital when he would breathe. And I remember he had hair, a lot of hair, and he looked a lot like his older sister. I remember that on the day of his funeral, it was extremely windy. Not only from the wind do I remember that, but from the wind blowing my hair and my beard everywhere.
Welcome to Still a Part of Us, a podcast where mom and dads share the story of their child who was stillborn or who died in infancy. I'm Lee Red, and on this episode, Jeff is telling the story of his son, Jeff Jr., who was diagnosed with bilateral renal agenesis and passed away shortly after birth. As a word of caution to our listeners, this story contains emotional triggers of stillbirth and infant loss.
So our family consists of me, Jeff, and my wife Bre, and our daughter Murphy, and little Jeff. And I'm your typical 9-to-5 working individual that enjoys coming home from a long day's work and spending time with my family and working on the yard and various projects.
What are some of your hobbies?
I love to play soccer and watch pretty much most sports except for baseball. It's not slamming baseball. I love to sell things on eBay. It's a fun hobby to just, doesn't make much money, just something to pass the time by with shipping and managing inventory and whatnot.
Is there anything in particular you sell, or?
So in particular, I sell random stuff that's from recovered freight auctions, and it could be anything from rubber bands to electronics of some sort or used stuff that's been being shipped somewhere. So Bre also sells on eBay separately, doing reselling used clothing and used electronics, anything she finds at thrift stores or clearance shelves from grocery stores. It's her full-time gig. We enjoy tackling big projects like remodeling our home. In fact, when we found out about little Jeff, we were in the middle of remodeling our 1950s home. And if anybody knows a 1950s home, it's a large task. And I remember one day tiling the kitchen with my dad and my brother, and I remember that I just from everything that we had going on, from learning out early on in Bre's pregnancy, that we wouldn't be able to keep little Jeff. I just broke down, and the people around you don't know how to act. You're even your dad and your brother, if I'm in that situation and it's somebody else, it's kind of like, well, what do you do? So you can't blame anybody. Except for, my dad just gave me a big hug. My brother just gave me a big hug, and no one said in that moment everything's going to be all right, because the story behind little Jeff is that at 20 weeks, we went in for our big ultrasound to go over, the key parts and make sure everything was functioning correctly. And we've been through this before with Murphy and and we had no complications, and didn't have a thought that we would go into this, learning of a complication. And we were, sitting in that room, a dark ultrasound room, and had, the doctor doing the ultrasound. From the get-go, she was very, very quiet and very careful on how she was saying things. And I didn't necessarily pick up on that, but Bre did. And as soon as she said, "I'm just going to go ask the doctor or your main doctor a few questions, and then we'll be back in a minute." And when she came back in the room, she said, "So it looks like you have little to no amniotic fluid," which could mean you're leaking amniotic fluid or the baby's not producing any, and that could mean that the baby isn't producing urine, and in turn doesn't create which means that either the urinary tract wasn't working or the kidneys weren't functioning. And so when they were looking at the renal artery, they weren't seeing any blood flow to any kidneys, which indicates that there, are no functioning kidneys or no kidneys. Either way, the result is the same. And they checked for if there was a leak, and that came back negative. And so it came out to be that our baby has bilateral renal agenesis, which means did not develop working or did not develop kidneys at all. And again, that was about 20 to 21 weeks into our second pregnancy. And when we went up to the hospital to get another look and to go to a hospital that was more knowledgeable in specializes in problems in pregnancy, and they went through the whole ultrasound all over again, like it was fresh, and it was all in the same day as the first one. And unfortunately we were thinking the worst, as far as like our child isn't going to survive, and if there's anything that we can do. And the result, obviously, of the ultrasound was the same, saying no amniotic fluid, there's no kidneys, which then in turn does not develop. The baby will not develop lungs because there's no amniotic fluid, and then will not survive at birth because not because it doesn't have kidneys, but because it won't be able to sustain life with the lack of lungs, the development of his lungs. And even at this time, they were unable to confirm to us that it was a boy, even though we had gone to a clinic early to find out, and they had told us it was a boy. But since they weren't unable to see detailed parts of little Jeff, because the amniotic fluid is what gives definition to the parts of the baby that they look for. And they came in and presented us two options, that we could terminate or carry until, or induce whenever. But whether we induced that day or that week or at 35 weeks, the result would be the same, that the baby would pass because of its fatal diagnosis and the bilateral renal agenesis. During this whole time, I mean, both me and Bre were both in like complete shock, and just feeling like our world is just crumbling down around us. Like everything that we felt like we were like remodeling this home, we were trying different things to keep ourselves busy before we even found out about this. And so everything just seemed like it was laid out all on top of us all at once. Everything in her pregnancy was, up until this point, was fine. And it had been fine in the sense of, it's like when we were pregnant with Murphy, we didn't have any complications. We didn't have any really no worries except for like what it feels like when you're, when it's your first child. You've never been through a pregnancy before, and you don't really know what to expect as a parent. But when the second time around, feeling like, we've been through a pregnancy before, so you're a little more aware of what's going on. But then it almost feels like something out of left field kind of turns you around and upside down. And I mean, we didn't have any fertility issues or anything like that. I don't have any knowledge of this condition being anything that's ever happened in my family or in Bre's family. And even if we would have done, we didn't really know what we were going to do, whether we were going to induce in 2 weeks to then start a grieving process, because we obviously knew the grieving wouldn't start until we had little Jeff, and until he passed, until we went through that process, whatever that looked like. At that time, I couldn't even tell you what it was going to look like or how it was going to be, or I just couldn't even, that's not something I could even imagine. But so yeah, at that time we didn't know what we were going to do. And after, much, I would say prayer, meditation, thought, we at some point we decided to carry as long as it was safe for Bre, so that we could have as much time with little Jeff as possible, knowing the inevitable. And what that looked like was 36 weeks of pregnancy, then inducing.
During that time, after receiving the news of the kidneys and what the future would look like for little Jeff and you guys, were you just delaying the grieving, knowing you would grieve as well? Or was there a time of, personally, I would think that if for myself, there would be 2 different grieving periods, knowing that my son, the writing's on the wall that he won't live, and then after his birth, knowing he won't live. How was that grieving, or did you just cherish the time of the pregnancy?
So that, I think, in and of itself was the hard thing, being able to, keep the positivity that he was alive, and he continued to be alive, and when he was born, he was alive, right? It was different in the sense that we had him with us, and we could feel his kicks. She could feel him moving around, and getting into after the inevitable, after he passed away, which I'll talk about in a second. It was definitely a different grief. You had this person, and then this person is gone, and then that part of the grief that wasn't there because he was still alive, now that he was gone and he passed away, that's when the grief of the loss started. And before, it was the grief of, I wouldn't say the phrase preparing ourselves grief, but for the lack of a better phrase, it was the grief that was preparing us for then the inevitable passing away and the death grief, which in a nutshell, is very separate and very distinct of a grief. He lived after birth. He lived for 6 hours. We held him every single minute, and in the delivery room, she was induced, and it was just Bre and I, and it was going to be me and Bre in the delivery room, and we were going to have her mom for the pictures because we didn't want just anybody in there to take pictures, and we wanted to spend the time, whatever time we had, instead of like me taking pictures and not being able to be right at Bre's side and by little Jeff's side. And we would have her take the pictures, and a group came up to talk to us from a children's hospital to talk with us about what help is out there for grieving parents, for grieving families, for grieving children. And that, they were explaining a bunch of different things. And it had only been a couple hours since we had come in, and Bre started feeling some pain, and the group left, and Bre just said like, "Hey, I'm feeling some pain," and the nurse checked, and little Jeff was pretty much almost here. And it was all happening so fast that we didn't even get to tell our family, before, like, as soon as they said that, they said, "Don't push, or you'll come right out and get the doctor that's on call." So our doctor that we had wasn't able to get there in time, and her mom for the pictures also wasn't there in time because everything happened so quickly. But we did get, a message out to the family to come, and that we wanted to be, have everybody come meet him, but then have a quick exit to then let us have our time with me, Bre, Murphy, and little Jeff, to then, spend that time as a family, to be able to cherish that time, that with, what little time that we had with little Jeff. One of the nurses is actually our next door neighbor in our townhome before, and she wasn't on our service, but she came in and she took pictures for us, and we were super grateful to have like a familiar face in the situation. And when little Jeff came out, they all gave us our space, and they, after cleaning him up, and he was alive, and he, you could tell, you could hear his chirp like I talked about at the beginning. And at first it was like a very uneasy sound to hear, but it almost, it's just something that I hear when I think of my little Jeff, as he struggled and fought to spend the time that he did with us. And we had him in a blanket on Bre's chest, and just held him for what was, of course, not enough time. So for us, it was a lot of things that we did leading up to and while he was alive, and then even after. A lot of the things we did were to be able to help us with our grieving process, and one thing that we wanted to do was have our family meet our our little Jeff. And we watched as like our family members stumbled through the door, and I was excited for my family and for Bre's family to meet little Jeff, and I was happy I was grateful for them that they did, because either way they were coming, no matter what the circumstance was, and either way they were going to meet him. And for us, it was something special to have our family support just come marching down, the hallway and into the door and into the room. And after they all left, and we were left with, as a family, me, Bre, Murphy, and little Jeff, and we had Bre's parents take Murphy out after about 20 to 30 minutes, and they transferred us rooms, and we had the rest of the time to spend with little Jeff. And we had decided that we would spend the time with him, and then after he would pass, we would then invite anybody to come back to spend time with us and to also spend time with little Jeff. But we wanted to make the most for our grieving process to, spend that time with him, talking with him, and just holding him. And I mean, we were trying our best to not think of the inevitable and just cherish those whatever hours, whatever it looked like. As the time went on, his breathing and his heart rate then started to slow, to become slower, and to almost become unnoticeable. And we would, every time we felt like, he had passed, we'd ask the nurse to come in to check his vitals, and she would listen for a heartbeat and listen for breathing. And I don't know how many times we had the nurse come in, but it was more than a few times. And I'll never forget the last time we got the nurse in, because that's when, obviously, she said she was going to go get the doctor, because the standard process is they have to, have the doctor pronounce the infant deceased. But obviously in that moment, so at that point when she went to go to the doctor, it had been 6 hours since he was born. And sure enough, doctor comes in and checks vitals, and gives us his condolences, and then walks out of the room, and then you feel we had each other, Bre and I, but we just felt so overwhelmed with sadness. Just, that even though we knew we were going to lose our child, but something that you can't really explain, losing a child. So the process from that point was, after a few hours, they would bring in a cold blanket, that you would lay the baby on to help from the natural way of
The decay of the body.
the inevitable decay of the body. It's so gruesome. But
It is what it is.
It is what it is. and we held him still, and we laid by him still, and we talked with him still, and we still love him as if he was still, living and laying right next to us.
So during the hospital stay, did you have 24 hours with little Jeff? Did the medical staff say after his demise you'd have 24 hours with him?
So they did say after his passing, we did have 24 hours that we could have him in our room, and at some point, I can't remember what time, but they offered to take him to do feet prints and to do hand prints and to do a picture so that we would have like a keepsake in like an outfit that we had purchased or that they wanted to supply or whatever. And I think he was gone for maybe an hour or two, and we had already planned to do hands and the feet ourselves just because we wanted to, do that for our keepsake. And we knew that they would do that for us, but we still wanted to do it ourselves just because we had that pride of, I'm gonna do this myself, and it's gonna look good. I'm gonna, put it in his keepsake, and I'm gonna cherish it forever. And unfortunately, we had waited too long for the hands, and it was extremely difficult to try and do the handprints. But the feet were fairly easy to do the footprint and to have our copy that we did, and also we have the copy from the hospital that they did as well. And we had decided we were going to set a time, and then we were going to give him to the hospital to move to the mortuary that we had chosen and start that process. We decided to give him at some point instead of have them take him away from us at 24 hours. And that's some advice we got beforehand, and it actually helped out a lot. So we had decided that at 11:21, which is the time he was born, but on the next day, that's the point that we wanted to, start the process of A, discharge, getting out of the hospital, B, handing little Jeff over so that we could then have him start the process of moving to the mortuary and having them pick him up. Obviously moving on to the inevitable next parts, which was, a funeral, because that's what we decided that, again, another thing that we decided to do as part of our grieving process, and felt like we would benefit from having a little spot to go to. And when we got out of the hospital, it was a Thursday afternoon, and Friday is the day that happens after Thursday, and that's when we felt like we would probably want to muster up the courage to try and go to the mortuary and start the planning and figuring out when we can move forward and pull off a funeral. And we're trying to do it on that Saturday, and the cemetery was having issues on trying to get that timeline to work, but it ended up all working out where we were able to get the baby plot, which is a part of the cemetery that, set aside for babies and infants, for those that choose to put in that area or maybe don't have other plots in that cemetery, and that can move the baby later in life to a different plot. But it worked out with the cemetery in the end and with the mortuary. And prior to this, neither Bre nor I had gone to the mortuary to discuss anything, or the cemetery to discuss anything with anybody. And so as we stumbled through all this, we had a lot of help from our family members, and to be able to, talk with the mortuary and talk with the cemetery and get things rolling. And I remember Bre and I went to the mortuary to discuss, a casket, and also other things that, come with funerals that I didn't feel like or think I would ever have to deal with at this time in my life. And as hard as that as that scenario was, to sit and look at flower arrangements that are supposed to go on the top of an individual's casket that's your size or my size. I'm supposed to picture that as going on this small little box that my child is going to be, put in. And so that wasn't the most pleasant. None of this has been pleasant, obviously, but none of this has felt natural in any way. As we left the mortuary, we went to go to the cemetery where Bre's parents had been, and we had picked a lot over FaceTime. One of their last 3 lots for the row, which they kind of labeled as 2018, but it was 2019. And he would be the first 2019 baby to be buried in this part of the cemetery. We came around the corner to come check out where we had selected to see it in person, and driving up to the area, and we saw city employee digging out his little baby plot. And that's when, I think I don't know if it was like the reality of the grief that started to set in, but that's when I remember just breaking down, and like I've done so many times before during this experience. And yeah, it's a hard thing to look at, to see. It's not something you see every day, that you go to the cemetery and you see somebody's grave getting hand dug, and it's not just anybody, it's your son's. So the next day we had the funeral. We got to see little Jeff again, and we took various items to send with him, if you will. Letters we wrote to him prior to his birth, and letters to him from after his birth. And I made him a bracelet out of hemp. Made matching ones for Bre and Murphy and I, and made another one for him that we could keep with us, but put one on his wrist, and had just our family, immediate family and grandparents come to the funeral home for a small viewing. And after a very, 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 very small service and prayer, we shut the casket and got into a limo, and I held little Jeff in the box as they drove us.
It is such a small box.
Yeah, it's a small box.
It is such a small box.
Just held him on my lap in the small box with Bre and Murphy in the limo, and we got to the cemetery and got to the curbside, and I just couldn't get out. I just couldn't get out of the limo. Because I obviously knew that was, that was the next step. And if you get out of the limo, that is the next step. And the next step leads to the next step. And I didn't want to take the next step. Finally mustered up the courage to get out of the limo and to bring out the box and to place him, on the graveside, and had some beautiful words that were spoken by Bre's dad and the bishop, and then I had the opportunity to say some words and to talk about my feelings as of having lost a child, and it being the most difficult thing that I've ever had to go through in my entire life. And then it all seemed, the funeral, I said my words, and we ended the funeral, and we let some balloons go for little Jeff, some blue balloons, because Murphy said his favorite color is blue. And it was a windy day. And it blew a bunch of balloons right into a tree, and they popped, but some of them made it through the tree, and it was an awesome reminder of, for us to be able to remember that day, the blue balloons, the wind, and all the people that supported us, and that came and was supporting us, and what we were going through. So That's what I remember about the funeral.
Many thanks to Jeff for coming on the podcast and telling us the story of his son, Jeff Jr. Head over to our website, stillapartofus.com. There you will be able to find the show notes, including the full transcription of the interview and any resources that were mentioned. There you will also be able to sign up for our short and helpful email newsletter. There you can learn how to become a patron and support the work it takes to produce this show for just a few dollars a month. And lastly, on the website, you can find out how to get in touch with us if you would like to share your child's story. This show was produced and edited by Lee and Winter Red. Thanks to Josh Woodward for letting us use his song, She Dreams in Blue. You can find him at joshwoodward.com. Subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend that might need it, and tell them to subscribe. Why would you do this? Because people need to know that even though our babies are no longer with us, they are still a part of us.